What are the ramifications of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, a message that we put out for some 34 years here at FFF. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, libertarian par excellence, professor of economics at the Citadel, taking a nice little vacation break as professors do during the summer, and well, as they do during the school year as well. Richard, good to see you again.
I think I'm happy to see you after those introductory remarks. Again, ladies and gentlemen, you see what I put up with for decades. With decades, it's so good that I'm calm, patient, tolerant. But it is good to see you and certainly our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, tune in. I mean, thank you all for tuning in. I met Richard way back in the 1980s. I was practicing law there in Dallas, Texas. Richard was a professor at the University of Dallas, and I hired him to tutor me in Austrian economics. And I'd go out and I'd see what kind of lifestyle he had, and all I could do was envy it. I mean, I was working my tail off as a lawyer, and here was Richard just taking life easy, teaching a couple of classes and living the good life. And I thought, boy, professors really do have it made. They're sort of like Supreme Court justices, they just lounge around, read magazines, and teach a couple of classes or whatever, write a couple of legal opinions, and that's it.
Oh, give me a break. He was out there chasing ambulances, getting somebody a big payoff because they stubbed their toe. I mean, give me a break.
All right, Richard, on to business. Richard, we've addressed a lot of issues over the 34 years here at FFF, and I remember that before the 9/11 attacks, you and I visited the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it would be an appropriate time in this Libertarian Angle to revisit those attacks. This is the anniversary week of those attacks, August 6th on Hiroshima and August 9th on Nagasaki. But I remember when we addressed these before the 9/11 attacks, I mean, we were just inundated with vicious emails attacking us. And I remember that a newspaper in Fredericksburg, Virginia, published my articles on this, and man, they got all this hate mail in. People, how can you dare question the atomic bombings of these cities? And I think it's important to revisit this. Now, back then, what was interesting is that there were still a lot of World War II veterans alive. And of course, they weighed in the predictable way. But today, I think it's safe to say that 99% of World War II veterans are dead. And now it's the Vietnam veterans, to a certain extent, maybe the Korean War veterans. So it's a different type of mindset today. But yet, when I recently wrote an article again condemning these atomic bombings, I got hit with a bunch of emails from people, that of our generation or younger, saying, "Oh, no, these bombings were correct." And so I think it's time. I think it's a good time to revisit these atomic bombings and to do so periodically. The most popular argument for these bombings is that they saved the lives of American soldiers. And the idea is that without the bombings, the U.S. would have had to invade Japan, which would have resulted in an untold number of U.S. soldiers being killed, as well as Japanese soldiers and Japanese civilians that die in war. And that therefore, as a kind of a mathematical cost-benefit analysis, that it was entirely proper to bomb these two cities in order to force Japan to make a quick surrender, and which thereby saved the lives of all the people that would have died in this invasion. Now, of course, over the years, there have been the sort of the utilitarian arguments against this, saying that an invasion would never have been necessary, that Japan was on its last legs, it was ready to surrender. We've got any number of military officials, generals, who made that case. and that all they needed was just a guarantee that their emperor, which they considered a deity, would not be executed, because the U.S. and Truman were calling for unconditional surrender, which was Roosevelt's policy before he died. And to me, it was a ridiculous, very destructive policy. They ended up letting the emperor live anyway, so it would have been no big deal to have agreed to that as part of a negotiated surrender. But I've never been really persuaded by that argument anyway. It's a utilitarian argument. My argument is that in wartime, you don't target women, children, seniors, and invalids. Armies fight armies, soldiers fight soldiers. And it's entirely immoral as well as illegal to kill non-combatants in war. And I bring up, whenever I get emails from people, I bring up Lieutenant William Calley in Vietnam. He was the U.S. officer that killed a large number, I forget what the number is, but I think it was at least dozens of women, children, defenseless people, just started massacring them. And ultimately, another U.S. soldier very heroically stood between them and said, "Stop it, you're not going to do this anymore." And Calley could have shot that guy. I mean, he put his life in the middle of this to save these Vietnamese people. But Calley ended up getting prosecuted and convicted. He was ultimately given a lenient outcome, but it was proper to indict him and convict him. The U.S. military did the right thing. Now, why did they do that? Well, because in war, you don't target non-combatants. It's considered a war crime. Well, my argument is, how is that any different from a pilot? When a pilot drops bombs on people, atomic bombs on seniors, invalids, women, children, how is that any different from an infantryman killing people with bullets? And therefore, it was entirely immoral and improper to do this. Now, is it possible that an invasion would have been necessary? I'll concede, okay, possible. Could a lot of soldiers have died? Absolutely. But that's what soldiers do. That's their job, to fight and win a war. And if they die, well, that's tragic. But you don't go and target women and children as a way to save the lives of those soldiers. It just remains just as improper for a pilot to do so as it is an infantryman. And I also should point out that it is the duty, the moral duty, and the legal duty of a soldier to disobey an illegal order and an immoral order. It's what soldiers are supposed to do. So you can't get off the hook and say, "Oh, well, they were just following orders." I mean, that defense went out at Nuremberg. If it's an illegal order, if it's an immoral order, get rid of it. Disobey it. Refuse to go along with it. Now, some of these critics also point out, well, we were firebombing Japanese cities in Dresden and over in Germany. What's the difference? Well, there is no difference. Those were just as immoral and illegal and improper as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The only difference was the number of casualties. But again, in war, soldiers fight soldiers. You don't attack and kill women, children, and seniors and invalids as a way to shorten a war. And I should also point out, Richard, that if the critics are correct about this principle, how can they complain if, let's say, Russia decides to drop an atomic bomb on Kiev in Ukraine? And their rationale is, well, there's a lot of Russian soldiers dying. This will bring a quick end to the war. This will save a lot of Russian soldiers as well as Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian civilians, because they're going to surrender immediately. Therefore, no problem with dropping the bomb on Kiev and killing all the women, children, and non-combatants in that city. I think most Americans would say, I'm not going to defend Russia doing that sort of thing. Well, then why defend the U.S. government when it does the same thing with respect to Hiroshima and Nagasaki? What do you think?
Well, like I sometimes try to do, let me put this in a little bit of historical context. One of the great elements of the classical liberal movement of the 19th century, besides ending slavery, ending mercantilism, and moving many countries, Britain, the United States, and others, in the direction of free trade, the emergence of domestic impartial rule of law, civil liberties, was the classical liberal campaign, an effort to, if not end war, to ameliorate or minimize the harm, damage, and destruction of war. However, imperfectly, this culminated in the Hague Conventions in the 1890s, in which they established rules of war, that even when nations were involved in battles as the opposing combatants, even nations at war should follow certain codes of conduct: treatment of prisoners, respect for the lives and property of civilians under the control of an invading occupying power, limits on the use of weapons that would be considered destructive or somehow unethical. While it sounds quaint today, one of them was, it's okay in a war, like hot air balloon with the basket underneath. It's all right to send up one of your soldiers in the basket of the hot air balloon as an observation over the battle line. But it would be against the rules of war to go over the battle line and drop a bomb from the basket of the enemy troops. Now that sounds quaint to us today. But notice that the principle, the idea was that even in war, there's supposed to be a certain decency and respect for the other. Certainly civilians and non-combatants, their lives and their property. And even captured soldiers in the humane treatment of them as prisoners of war. Now, all of this got thrown out in the 20th century with the two world wars to a great extent. The one example in World War I was, of course, the use of poison gas, in which both sides ended up using poison gas, maiming and killing, blinding multitudes of people on both sides of the battle. It's mustard gas. And then this was even worse in the Second World War. What was one of the shocking things in the early period of the start of the Second World War in Europe? My God, look what the Germans have done to Warsaw. They bombed Warsaw into rubble. Look what they did when they invaded Western Europe. Rotterdam, bombed into rubble. The strafing of civilians who are refugees trying to move away from the battlefront in Belgium or France, or certainly in Poland. Shocking. The Germans are inhumane. They are targeting civilians, random and arbitrary destruction. They have no respect for the rules of law and decent behavior among civilized nations. And this source went on in the Second World War. The Japanese were doing the same thing in the Pacific, et cetera, et cetera. And that was part of the moral, the ethical, the righteous moral and emotional sense of they're the bad guys and we're the good guys. I know that because my mother was alive during the war. She was a civilian employee in the Department of Navy in Washington, D.C. And this is spirit of the time. And there was an acceptance of bombing German cities, bombing Japanese cities. My mother had no regrets about the United States dropping the bombs, because as far as she was concerned, it ended the war quickly and saved American lives. And most Americans, one could probably safely say, probably felt the same way in the summer of 1945. But the fact is, how was the acts that we were performing at that time, as you were saying, any different than what we were accusing the Germans and the Japanese of? The fire bombing of Hamburg or Dresden. The fire bombs were so hot and massive in Hamburg that people, civilian Germans, children, were melting into the asphalt in the streets before the oxygen was sucked out of the air to suffocate them. Dresden was absolutely destroyed. All of us have seen these pictures of German cities, including Berlin. And this was planned. Was there strategic bombing? Obviously, you want to knock off German railways and bridges and armaments factories and the V2 rocket locations. What you were saying, military targets, soldier against soldier. But this was an intentional, conscious attempt to break the will of the German and also the Japanese people through terror bombings of huge proportions. In the first half of 1945, before the atomic bombs, the firebombing of Japanese cities killed over 350,000 people. In March, the firebombing of Tokyo killed tens of thousands of people. Those numbers with fire bombings in these ways and non-strategic bombings far outweighed the number of people tragically who were killed in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In fact, when American pilots in Europe were being ordered to undertake these indiscriminate bombings, some of them were complaining to their superiors that we did not sign up to be baby killers. These pilots were told, shut up and do what you're told, or you will be arrested and convicted for dereliction of duty and even treason. So how can you accuse the Nazis and the Japanese of these kind of behaviors and then try to justify you doing it yourself? Ethics and morals should be the same for everyone. Again, just as you were saying, war is hell, as Sherman said. And in war, people die. But it should be viewed as both morally, and if there's any sense of the meaning of these rules of war, it should be combatant opposing combatant. And things happen in war, but it should not be the intention, the purpose, or the design for the bombing, the attacking, the destroying, the killing, the maiming of innocent civilians or their property. That certainly have nothing to do with the opposing country's war effort. And then if I could just add part of the utilitarian argument, Jacob. And I did a review of the book I'm about, right, basically to slightly summarize, when we did our book on the failure of America's foreign wars. It's a review I did of a book called The Invasion of Japan. Now, of course, the invasion of Japan never occurred because of the atomic bombs being dropped and the Russians invading Japanese territory in Manchuria. But the fact is that what the author points out is that long before, months before the dropping of the bombs, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had done serious studies of what would be the consequences of an invasion of the home islands. They didn't pull any punches. Thousands of Americans would die. But this idea that was then plastered about 1 million Americans would die was absolutely wrong. And furthermore, the numbers would have been no worse than the number of Americans who died tragically also in the liberating of the Philippines. Why? Because Douglas MacArthur's intelligence had broken the Japanese defense codes for the home islands. They knew the defenses, the positions of the forces, and the U.S. military strength, which was not facing a Japanese Air Force anymore, could have pulverized all the Japanese defense positions before any invasion had occurred, so that American casualties would have been minimized. The Japanese attempt to defend the home islands would have been obliterated, and at some point the Japanese would have surrendered without the dropping of the atomic bombs. So that even by that basis, war is hell, and soldiers have their jobs. An additional tragedy of this, of course, not everybody in the US military was a volunteer. There was a massive conscription. So whether you want to go or not, you were put in harm's way. But soldiers are supposed to die in war and not the innocent bystander. And we could have avoided the huge loss of life, at least in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if we had chosen a different way. Now, why did Truman do this? Oh, to save lives. Oh, to show the Russians that we had this super bomb so that they stay in line after the war had ended. We invested in it and we spent all this time and effort. Well, we have to have a result. We have to prove that it works and get a bang for our buck. I mean, these are kind of rationales and arguments that were given certainly at the time and certainly afterwards. But the question is what about the morality of it? Did it make us better, or did it make us, in fact, equal to those who we were fighting and their conduct in the war? And was there even a rationale, given the reality of war, to have followed this path of killing not just hundreds of thousands of people in these bombings, but the radiation effect on future generations? And in my opinion, the answer is no.
Yeah, you make a lot of good points. I mean, war is vicious, and some of our critics write and say, well, the Japanese troops were just vicious to American troops. The Bataan Death March, for example, killing the civilians and so forth. But what they're really saying is we had a right to be just as vicious, just as criminal as they did because they were doing it. And I think what you're saying is no, that we have to maintain the high ground even within the viciousness of the enemy. And a good example of this is the treatment of prisoners. That, okay, we know how the Japanese treated prisoners. Does that mean that the United States should treat the Japanese prisoner the same way? Of course not. He's just an individual soldier. He's just following orders like any other individual soldier. And as a practical matter, you're actually better off treating your prisoners of war in a very good way. Because once word leaks out among the enemy that you're treating your prisoners of war very nicely, they have more incentive to surrender. Saying, hey, man, it's not so bad to be an American prisoner of war. But if you treat them viciously with torture and the type of things that the Japanese were doing, like the Bataan Death March, then they have the incentive to fight to the death. So I think what you're saying is we don't want to become like them, even in war. You also mentioned conscription, which is a very interesting point because, this is often called the good war. Well, Richard, if it was such a good war, why were Americans being forced to fight in it? I mean, you would think that if it was that good, they'd have more than enough Americans being willing to volunteer to fight in it. But the fact is that many Americans understood that this war was never necessary in the first place. And I think it's important to emphasize that point, that Franklin Roosevelt is the culprit here. He was the president who wanted to get America involved in this war. And he campaigns in the 1940 election by saying, I promise you that your boys are never going to be sent into another foreign war. I've said it again and again and again, he said. And he was lying. He wanted to get America embroiled in the European conflict. Americans said no. They had seen what had happened with World War I. They wanted America's founding foreign policy of non-interventionism, stay out of Europe's incessant, endless wars. And that was their mindset going into World War II. So Roosevelt, realizing that the Germans were not going to take his bait because he figured, oh, if I can get them to attack, then Congress will have no choice but to declare war, and I've got America into the war. I circumvent the American people. He goes into the Pacific and intentionally and knowingly provokes the Japanese into attacking. Even his supporters now admit this. Now, there's this debate as to whether he knew that the attack was coming at Pearl Harbor or at the Philippines or wherever, but there's really no more reasonable doubt that he wanted this attack to happen. And that was the point of his oil embargo. That was the point of humiliating demands on Japan. He wanted an attack to get his declaration of war. Japan never had any interest in going to war with the United States before those provocations. Well, what would they need to go to war against the United States for? I mean, they were, vicious regime. What they were doing in China was vicious, but there was never any quest to conquer the United States. The attack on Pearl Harbor was very limited. It was on a military target, not on a civilian target, and it was designed to knock out the U.S. fleet so that Japan could get into the Dutch East Indies and extract the oil that they could not get because of Roosevelt's embargo. So if Roosevelt doesn't put the embargo on, there is no reason for Japan to attack at Pearl Harbor, which means there is no Pacific war at all. There never is a Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There is no massive troops being killed at Iwo Jima or the Philippines or wherever. There is no war there. And so what I find fascinating is that when people are defending Truman's attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there is not this degree of animosity that should be leveled against the US president that was the root cause of this entire war in the first place, Richard.
Yeah, one other little side note to that is that if the United States had not undertaken this embargo, uh, it would have enabled the Japanese to maintain their war in China in terms of necessary materials, including oil. But the fact is that the war in China had been going on since 1937. The Japanese had occupied a huge swath of eastern China, the port cities, major commercial centers. But the Chinese government, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, had withdrawn to central and western China. They had reinforced their forces, and the Japanese were bogged down in basically an unwinnable war, facing the Chinese army, however inept from certain perspectives, guerrilla forces behind their lines, a population that hated them because the Japanese were unbelievably cruel. But they certainly were not viewed as liberators. So in trying to make their own empire in China, the Japanese had got themselves into a swamp that would have gone on and on. A tragedy for the Chinese people, but that war went on till 1945 anyway in China. And the fact is that the Japanese would have been swallowed up in their own unwinnable war on the Asian continent. And however tragic it would have been for the Chinese, it would have not required a quote global war in the Pacific to weaken Japan.
Okay. On that note, really, Richard, we'll wrap things up. Enjoyed the conversation as always. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for 34 years of principled arguments and videos and conferences and the like. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.